3-month point, 6-month point, whatever points, we're going to do a data draw. And we're going to see what's going on in the study. This is how they define the futility point. So they'll say if by a year we're not seeing this degree of difference between the two groups, we know statistically we'll never see a difference, and the trial must stop. So there's all these things called stop rules and management rules to manage the trial. And so one of the things you have to define in advance is an adverse event. And then there's also like random and unforeseen adverse events that can be looked for in the people whose bodies have these drugs. And so we said, you know, where's your adverse events list? They had not come up with one in the beginning, so they quickly came up with adverse events. So they went to all the people that were administering the randomization thing, which is a whole other story. They were using a wheel at one point because they couldn't explain randomization to the clients, and the clients didn't believe them when they pushed a button on the computer. They had this conspiracy theory, oh, they're giving it to me. So they had a wheel, and they'd spin it, and you were either on the red side or the white side. I mean, we viewed that as like cruel. So they were talking to all these research assistants who were sitting with these poor people, basically saying, you're getting ahead of me. They had to talk to the people who were basically managing the housing that the people were in. And so they came back and they said, here's the kind of bad stuff that's happening. And so we're going to define these as adverse events. So like, if someone set their apartment on fire, that was an adverse event. A couple of people attempted to commit suicide or did commit suicide, that was an adverse event. And so we had a long battle with them about what to consider an adverse event. They wanted to have really extreme things. We said at one point, it looks like every event of randomization is an adverse event, because the people are leaving and they're really upset. And so that seems like you have taken someone whose life was going along, you did something to them and now they're worse. Is that not an adverse event? And so we kind of made them adopt a fairly strict adverse event list. And at one point they exceeded the number of adverse events they were allowed to have. And so we stopped the trial. They were about 30 people short of filling their complete number of people that they needed. And so they came back in when they got that notice and they said, no, you're going to ruin the whole trial. You're going to cause us to delay recruitment. And so those people will be in the trial too late to study them for the length of the trial. And we said, tough luck. And so they were shut down for about, I think, 2 months. They could do any recruiting. Questions? It gets worse.
Hi. I am an artist and always work with the academic, the professor, and I like to use their research to be my material to create. But sometimes I think some of the research will based on the wrong directions, and the assumption is very the assumption is not very good. but we are very hard to say or explain to the professor or those people. So I'm interested to be here to hear some thought about it. And so I am so curious, because you do the research and share it within the academia, and is the research will affect them or stimulate them to think more about from the human rights aspect. Because a human rights is always a concept, and we don't really take real in every aspect. although in social work or in the daily life practice, we always just say the concept. So if not many professors will think about it, then how can we do from outside? Because most of the time the NGO will very fast to notice the problem, and because they always spend time with the case and with the people, and they always know that some of the research is very not very good. But I just wonder, can some people outside the academia can do something and back to the school, and if there are any experience in Canada, can share with us.
In some ways, the experience of Canada is a bad experience because it's a really progressive and socialist country, and so Canadian academics were very, very involved in the action research movement, the community-based research movement. And so for about 10 years, there was a huge amount of money available to researchers to do community university alliance research projects. And so there were lots of rules and regulations and norms around how you developed these partnerships. And so, the first year people would be like, oh, come and do this project. And then the research agencies were like, no. So they began saying, no, the relationships have to be of long standing. And so there was a kind of demand that they're genuine long-term relationships, not like I grabbed you because I needed to have a community partner kind of relationship. So I think in Canada, the researchers and the funding agencies have tried really, really hard to make the academy work in a way that's responsive to the people that we're supposed to be working on behalf of. This is why yesterday I talked about state researchers as semi-elected, as having the power of the people delegated to us to produce knowledge. And I don't think we take that seriously. I think we think, oh, we're the researchers, and there are people down there, right? Not the people have given us the responsibility for developing knowledge. So it is the people's decision to decide what questions to ask. So obviously that's extremely difficult to do. So one of the projects that I've done a lot of things that maybe were not not effective, but maybe effective. So when I first got to Canada about 18 years ago, I had a lot of money and I had a lot of graduate students, and I thought, great, we can do good things. Let's go find out who needs something. And so we went around, and there were a lot of groups that had funding, and we're like, maybe they can hire somebody to do stuff. Let's go for groups that are really, really tiny. They're so small that they don't have the ability to even apply for funding. And so we started working with these tiny little groups. And I had the idea, like, if it's $5,000 or less for us, we'll just do it. If it's more than that, then maybe they need to apply for a grant. And we had kind of like a financial threshold. And if we can do it in 6 months, then we can do it. So we had this kind of like get in, get out, really quick model. And we viewed ourselves as technical assistants. And so we never, ever did research on our own behalf. And it was a rule that I had with my graduate students. I said, your MA is this, our job is this. You cannot do the same project for both pieces. So a lot of professors have their graduate students do a community project as their MA thesis. And I just felt like that was, in one way, very challenging for an MA student to navigate the moral terrain, navigate the ethical terrain. And so I said, we won't put you in the situation where you've got to make that decision. So people were doing research on topics that weren't really their own research on. And so we were able to genuinely, I think, go in and say, you know, what do you need? And people would tell us, and we'd be like, they would often tell us quite stereotyped things. We need this type of research, and we'd be like, nah, you don't really need that. What you really need is this. And we would work with them and say, do you want research to give to a funding agency, or do you want research to figure out how to make your group work better? Those are two different types of research. So we did quite a bit of like education work in the community at really, really small, low level to help people understand what is the research process. Do you really need research or not? Because most of the researchers are like, oh, we want to do research. Join us. We'll get this money. Join us. We were like, yeah. You know, so I feel like I spend more time convincing people that they didn't need research, actually, than I did convincing them to do research. And so this was kind of the model that we used going in. So in this process, one of the things I discovered was that pretty much everything anybody needed to know was in a box of newsletters or a box of some kind of record keeping that the group already had. And so then we began trying to work with groups around kind of like re-understanding the stuff they had already produced as like research, maybe better than research, because it was responding to questions that they had come up with themselves, not questions researchers had come up with. And so I created a huge archive with all the community groups, and we digitized all of their newsletters, and then we cataloged it. It cost a huge amount of money to do it. Some of the groups helped. They wanted to participate. We created a catalog to like everyone together, so that like maybe one group wanted to use prostitute as a term, and another group wanted to use sex work. And we'd be like, well, decide how do you want to catalog these particular materials. So it was a really, really long process. And we spent a huge amount of time with this massive amount of materials that had come out of the community groups. And at that point I was like, there doesn't need to be research. It's already been done. The community groups asked this question 10 years ago. Here's their response. Somebody needs to implement this kind of research. So that became my training process. So I was able to do that for about 15 years. And so there was I think I had about 35 or 40 graduate students in that period of time who kind of came through this training process. And some of them now are continuing to try to work in that way. But we were against research, against formal academic research from a very early point, and kind of raising questions all the time, saying to our colleagues, whose question is it? How did that question come up? Is it your question, or is it the community group's question? Oh, your question. Oh, did you know that the community group asked that 10 years ago? There was a panel at the public library on this. So I tried to get my colleagues to think about these archival materials as a kind of history of knowledge production by the community that was already sitting there waiting for them to use. There's another person at another university who was also, there were several of us, I don't want to sound like I'm the hero of the story, but there were a number of us sort of working in Vancouver and a couple of other cities trying to basically enable the communities to feel like they could fight back or raise questions or participate in a meaningful way. So these people are now scattered throughout the system. I think I get phone calls every so often saying, oh, it's really bad, we're not doing it. The solution is not to send everyone to the university to get a research degree. That's like what happens a lot of times is people are like, oh, become an academic. That's fine if that's the job you want, but it kind of makes the problem worse in a way.
Could you say what kind of community?
You know, in this project, it was everything. There was a bus riders union. So there was a union of people who identified as riders of the bus, who tried to do transportation activism. The women's health, like the local women's health clinic that had started as a collective. In fact, both of the mental health agencies that I would work with later in this project were involved. So we got the whole radical psychiatry era set of newsletters from the group that was now very like Suits and Ties. We had a lot of criterion for accepting materials. And so we worked with them. At first they were like, we don't want these materials in the archive, in the public archive. Why? Because they're obscene drawings. And we don't want people to see our organization today as having those. So we didn't fight with people. We didn't say, we wanted the groups to be happy to have the materials in. So we spent quite a bit of time working with them around, like, could this be okay? Not okay. In the US and Canada, the very, very wealthy Carnegie and Mellon families endowed libraries all throughout North America. And they tend now to be in urban, poor settings. So the Carnegie Library was one of the participants. So they have their own newsletter. It's kind of like all possible topics in that neighborhood. So it's a really good source of information. But it was also a good partner for us because they had so many other contacts in the community. They helped us. We were always worried about how to develop the relationships with people who were new. So we had what I thought of as a brokerage model. And so we always had a third party who connected us with the community group. Because we're like the giant university and they're the little tiny group. And so if they're unhappy, how will I know? I'm a nice person. I don't want to think people are mad at me. I try, but how can I know? So we always had a third person involved. And so Carnegie brokered a number of these relationships with us.